Come join me in my creative space where we can paint, learn, and have a few laughs. So get comfy and let's get started. Welcome everyone, Kat here. Thanks for joining me today to paint a rosemary plant. It's to go with our Watercolor Herb series. We've done a few so far, and if you're just tuning in, there are 3 other videos, I believe. And by the time we're finished, hopefully there will be at least 6. So check out the channel, and there's plenty of videos to suit anybody's needs. If you're a beginner, a very new beginner, or at an intermediate level, I think you'll find a video that'll suit you. All right, let's get started. I think this is something you can do freehand. I will include a drawing at the end of the video. However, maybe you could use it as a guideline, simply because the leaves are so small that the drawing may confuse things a little bit. You just start with the light leaves and then work your way to the dark ones. The only colors aside from green that I'm using is jaune brillant. It's kind of like, if you don't have it, you could use you can even use a white if you like, but I'm just mixing it with a bit of my green to do a stem, to start with the stem color. And I'm going to make 2. So this ends up being like a very mild green color, and it will be more woody looking. It will be later. If you happen to be looking for a picture of it, if you want a different reference, you can always go to Unsplash or Pixabay. They have free reference photos. All right, I'm going to start with a sap green. You can use any light green that you like. So this is fairly watery, and I'm doing all the light branches first. So I'll start with this one. I'm going to do one up here and over here. And I'm trying to do the ones that are in the back and on the side of the plant. So you can do them, mostly they grow upward, but sometimes you get the odd one that grows outward. And they tend to grow in 4s. So they have a little nub here, and then they go in 4s. I wonder if you're getting a bad shadow. Yeah, you are. Okay. Okay, hopefully you'll get less shadow now. So they grow in 4s. So there's usually like a little bud, and then they have 4 leaves growing out of them. They're not going to be in front of the stems. I'll explain why in a minute, why I'm doing it this way. And it's okay if they overlap. You kind of want that. It's kind of interesting to look at when they overlap, when everything's not in the same direction. So I'm using a brush. I can either push down on the brush and just come down to or I can use the tip of the brush and make the shape myself. It doesn't matter. I try to alternate a little bit. These are kind of a funny color. That's why I'm changing. I'm just adding a little bit more sap to them. This is the sap green. I have a tray full of greens because we've been doing a lot of herbs lately. And the wonderful thing about watercolor is that you don't have to waste your paint. You can just re-wet it and you're good to go. It's especially true when you're painting botanicals, because it's surprising how little paint you need. A tiny bit of paint goes so far. Okay, now I'm going to do this side. A little bit watery, not so much so that it's too light. Like, I find these a bit too light, but that's okay. We can change that later. So I'm going to do the same kind of thing here. You'll notice I'll speed up a few times throughout the video, just because it's the same old, same old. If you want to slow it down, just hit the cog wheel on your screen and you can slow it right down to the speed that you're comfortable with. I love rosemary. I make stuffed roast chicken with rosemary. I just stuff it with a few sprigs of rosemary and some garlic. Oh, it's so delicious. Every time we paint, I talk about food and I say how delicious it all is. You can tell I like to eat. So when you're painting these, it can be reminiscent of a Christmas tree plant. What Christmas tree plant? Of a pine tree. I think this is good to start. Yeah, if I need more, I'll do them later. Before I do anything else with these, when you look at a rosemary plant, the two sides are different colors. Usually the back is lighter than the front, but because in watercolor we paint light to dark, I'm choosing to do the opposite. So these are going to be the front of the leaves, and I haven't put the back in just yet. So I'm just adding color in the middle of each leaf and making sure there are no hard lines. Now I'm going to soften that out on every one of them. Okay, so we're just going to add a little bit of a darker color in the centers. Okay. So we're going to let this completely dry and I'll be right back with the next step. Okay, so this is nice and dry. So to recap, we did the first layer of any light green you choose, and then we went back in the center with a little bit of dark. You can use the same green, you just have to use less water in it, or you can use a totally different green as long as it's not too dark. And this is why. The next step, we're going to be adding some darks. And so that will be the back of the rosemary leaves. And they're going to be touching the stems. So it's going to go right out of the stems. And as you can see, this is a pretty significantly darker color. I would like to change my brush, and I will as soon as I'm finished. With the brush, the paint in this brush. Now this color has to be dark enough to be able to go over those other layers and not see through them. Okay, now I'm changing my brush. So this is definitely why your first layer has to be nice and dry, because you're painting right over it. And don't be afraid to cover this stem, because it is growing right out of the stem, right out of the front. And there are some on the sides, of course, but you don't see them as well. So paint some straight, some curvy, and that'll tell the viewer how the leaf is growing out of the stem, what direction it's growing in. Okay, and this one I'm going to just make it a little darker so it covers those lighter branches. So before this dries, we're going to try a little trick. Here's my glass of water, and here's my brush. It's a teeny tiny brush, and I'm going to put the tip of my brush in the water, and that's it. I don't want it to touch the ferrule, so I'm just putting the tip in, And then I'm going to run my brush down the center of these leaves to see if I can get a nice white vein. Or almost white. If it doesn't work, that's okay, because we can always go in with our method, our scrubbing method. Whew, good thing there was no paint in that. When you're working small, sometimes your paint dries too quickly to do this method. Now I'm going to take a paper towel I have. Just going to sop up some of that just to see if it comes up a bit better. There we go. Yeah, I think those are too dry, so we'll go and do our scrubbing method later. In Montreal, we had a nice storm this weekend for Easter weekend, and everybody's out of power and trees have fallen. It's quite something. It's not like in 1997, but it's still pretty inconvenient. I was very lucky that I kept my power, but there were a lot of people who weren't as lucky, and they lost their food, and they have young children to feed, and oh, what a nightmare. We're so dependent on electricity. It's very, very hard to live without. There. It looks good if you overlap them. And once again, let's try the water method. Wet the brush. Ooh, see, that's too much water. Yep. Yeah, way too much water. So let's try this one. Yeah, they're so tiny, it's really difficult to not put too much water down. Yeah, I'll wait and I'll do some scrubbing. So I can use a couple of extra leaves here. This is, this green is from Winsor & Newton, this sap green, and I don't find it as warm as other sap greens. Let that. Now, while the darks are drying, if you have enough room, try to go in the center of your green. Actually, try to wet your light green ones first. I think that's the best. Wet it first and come in with a bit of dark. Not too dark, just a little darker than you have. Just follow the shape of the leaf that you have. If you get any sharp lines, just soften them out. I wonder if any of you have the time, if you care to, if you wouldn't mind, if you could just drop in the comments what day that you like to watch your YouTube videos. I'm very curious to see what day would be best for me to put my videos out, and I want to see if it's the same as what YouTube says it is. I'm just very curious. So if you could help me out with that, that would be wonderful. Just a tiny bit there. Okay, I'm starting to fuss too much. I'm going to do this side. I'm going to wet some of the leaves. Very tiny brush going into my very dark. This is this green is Viridian or Phthalo green, something in that family. And I'm using a cool orange. It's called Paranone orange. So if you don't have that, you can use a bit of a cool red. So when I say a cool red, don't use a vermilion or cadmium. Use something closer to like scarlet and crimson. It's got a pinkier look to it. So this is just a tiny, tiny vein I'm choosing to put in. On the front leaves. Now, I say this in a few videos that watercolor goes through, sometimes it's kind of an awkward stage. Some people call it the ugly stage. I think it depends sometimes on what you're painting. I don't find it as much with botanicals, although the reason I'm bringing it up is because I do find this is kind of ugly. Until we can get to the good part, all those little details are going to make this. Going to make it or break it. I am now going to find some veins for the back ones. So this is my thinnest brush. It is a, I bought this, it's a Princeton Snap. I find it quite good to remove paint. So I'm just going along the back and then I'm going to dampen it up. Now I should wait a bit longer for the rest to dry, actually. I'm taking chances for nothing because the other leaves are not dry yet. And if you have to turn, whoops, if you're working on a curve and you're right-handed, turn your work towards you so that you can make that curve quite easily. Always use clean water for this part. If you really have trouble with this part, you can always go in with a little bit of white watercolor paint, because white watercolor paint, when you put it on, might look really white, but it doesn't stay white. It grays itself out because it's too translucent. It's not opaque enough. Before I do anything else to the leaves, I'm going to work on the branch itself. A color that would work well for this is burnt sienna, raw sienna. This is yellow ochre. This is raw sienna. These are quite close. And this is burnt sienna. One of my favorite colors. It's very versatile. And I think I'm going to use a little bit of brown. So first I'll mix these two. There. So I'm just adding a little bit of color to the pale green. And as it gets closer down, it's going to actually turn woody. So you're just going to dot in this woodiness here and there, and it's gonna look grainy. It's gonna give it some texture, and all of a sudden you're gonna say, "Oh, yeah, that looks like a stick," because rosemary, when it's young, it's kind of this color. It could be even light green, and then as it gets older and larger, as the plant grows, it gets woody. The bottom is very woody. I don't know if it affects the flavor. That part I don't know. So what I'm doing is I'm just adding a little bit of color into that very light branch we made. Just, it's barely there, but it adds something to the painting, and it just fills in that center. Now your leaves don't look like they're floating in midair. So I'm just filling it in with some raw sienna and yellow ochre. I'm going to do the same with this one. Yellow ochre is such a beautiful color too. In some sets it is not transparent, and in some it is. So when you're shopping for your watercolors, if you can, the first thing I look at is the light fast rating and the transparency level. And that helps me decide what color I'm going to choose. So it's important to me that my colors, most of them are light fast, because sometimes I have sold a couple of paintings, a few paintings, and I give them away, and I have a few hanging in the house, and I don't want them to fade over time. I think that looks quite nice. What do you think? So in between where these two branches join, I just put a little bit of a darker brown right there in the center. And when this dries, I may go over a little tiny bit more, because the watercolor dries lighter, as we all know, and it's just to make sure that it shows up enough. Sometimes you'll notice on your watercolor paper that the texture of the paper makes it difficult to get a smooth line, especially if your paint is just drying out on that brush stroke. Right as you're doing your stroke, it dries out. I know it's a little bit frustrating, but just go over it later if you want a sharper edge, like I want one right there. There we go. And here, I just want to make these veins show up a little better. In fact, I may use a different color to do that. I'm getting brave here, folks. I'm adding a little bit of purple in, just right around the veining. I think I may do what I suggested earlier to you. I'm going to use some white paint to do these, just to give them a little bit of life. But before, I'm going to mix up a nice little batch of mauve. And I thought I would put a few flowers. So I'm going to sneak in a few little tiny flowers here and there. And they kind of grow out of the stem, and they're complex looking little flowers, but I'm doing a very simplified version of them. I just want to add a hint of color, so when I hang the collection of herbs together, we'll see something other than just green. So I'm not trying to get the exact flower. I just want a shape that resembles a flower. And it certainly adds a little bit of color. We'll see how they go. We may need to add a bit more color. If they fade, I tried not to add too much water so that they shouldn't fade too much. I'm hoping. And while I wait for that, I'm going to get my white. There's a color called Buff Titanium that you can use in place of Jaune Brilliant. And you can also use it to replace the white that I'm about to use. Okay, so I'm going to wet my brush enough to just to add it to some green. I don't want it to be white, white, white. And I'm dabbing off my brush on the ferrule. I'm not touching the tip. I'm just going to let the ferrule, not the ferrule, the belly of the brush sit on my paper towel like that. And then after all that, I don't have enough paint on it. There. And we're just going to go tickle down the backs. And it's going to fade. It's not going to be white, white, because you have green in there. And because watercolor fades. So if you're going to do this painting, take a practice sheet. Just if you don't have a practice sheet and you don't want to waste your watercolor paper, get a brown grocery bag, get any kind of paper just to see what colors you want. You don't have to waste your paper. You can also use the back of the paper you choose for your painting. No one will see if you paint back there. So just play around, mix two greens, but make sure one is dark enough to cover all your under layers. Another great way to come up with a color scheme is to go to the grocery store and buy, they sell these herbs you get a couple of sprigs in a little plastic container. That might be an idea to get an accurate color scheme going. Or just choose two greens that you like to look at. So I'm just adding a teeny bit of lemon yellow around the edges of my lighter leaves. Because as I said, I was very disappointed in that color from... My favorite sap green is Daniel Smith, but it's grainy a little bit. Like, I think this particular one is it's granulating. It's a granulating color. And so I think that the Daniel Smith one is kind of granulating. I could be wrong. I would like it if someone could tell me if it's just me. But I do find that it has a grainy look to it sometimes, and sometimes that's okay. And other times I really don't like it in my paintings, depending what I'm doing. Before I learned about granulation, and I did on request a painting of a mother and granddaughter, a grandmother and granddaughter, and I didn't realize that ultramarine blue was granulating, and so I incorporated it into the skin tone so that I could make a nice shadow color. And it was nice, but because it was granulating, it kind of made the person look like they had very, very subtly, but like stubble. And so now I'm very careful about what I choose to use ultramarine on, and granulating colors, period. But they're very beautiful when that's what you want. And in a landscape, they're quite attractive. So I just find it's adding a little tiny bit of color that was missing. There was a little bit of warmth missing, I think. You don't have to add it everywhere, just here and there. And I would say that's our rosemary complete. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Happy watercoloring. Bye-bye.